Good evening, ladies and gentlemen from Sri Lanka, and good morning to Canada, Professor Sandeep. First, on behalf of Institute of Town Planners Sri Lanka, I wish to welcome you all for this continuing professional development program on urban planning regulation and its implications for city inclusion. Before starting the program, I just want to remind the participants few things that please keep mute your mics and mute your cameras. And you can ask your questions in the chat box through the chat box. And if you have any further clarification you wish to ask, you can use the raise hand option. So in order to start the program, I wish to invite Dr. Chathuranganee. Let me introduce Dr. Chathuranganee. Dr. Chathuranganee Jayakody is the post-doctoral researcher at Department of Biological and Geographical Science at School of Applied Science, University of Huddersfield. She is the member of Global Disaster Resilience Center and currently working in a collaborative research project called REGARD. Her current research interest in the areas of built environment in the perspective of displacement, planning and designing sustainable shared spaces, public open spaces, urban planning and urban designing interventions for disaster resilience. Dr. Chathuranganee is an urban planner, graduated from Department of Town and Country Planning, University of Moratuwa. She has completed a master's degree in urban design at the University of Salford, UK. She was awarded as a PhD in architecture and built environment by the University of Huddersfield. So over to you, Dr. Chathuranganee.
Thank you, Prasanna. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to moderate this session. It's a great pleasure. And to start the session, I would like to introduce you the focus of this session today and the session objective structure, and then I will introduce the speakers to you. So the session is focused on urban planning regulation and its implications for city inclusion, with a special reference to Canadian urban planning experience. And this event is conducted as part of the continuing professional development event series organized by Center for Urban and Regional Planning, which is the training arm of the Institute of Town Planners, Sri Lanka. So this program is designed to achieve four main objectives. Firstly, to explore how the land use and urban development regulations generate inequalities and why should we consider the human rights and equity issues when drafting the land use regulations and planning laws, and how to promote equity considerations in land use and urban development regulations. And then the latter part of the session, we will try to focus on the applicability of equity considerations in land use and urban development regulations in the Sri Lankan context. So the session is structured into three main parts. Within the first hour, Professor Sandeep Agrawal, who is very much experienced in looking at the planning regulations under the lens of equity, will be delivering his presentation on planning regulations and its implications for city inclusions. And then there will be a 20 minutes panel discussion on the applicability of the equity considerations in land use and urban development regulations in the Sri Lankan context. And this panel discussion will be followed by a open Q&A session, and we would like to invite you all your active engagement in this session at the latter part. So moving on to the main item of the agenda, I would like to warmly welcome our keynote speaker today, Professor Sandeep Agrawal. Professor Agrawal is an urban and regional planner whose research interests include land use and regional planning, international planning, multiculturalism and human rights, and public policy. His international work includes high-density rural regions in India and effects of tall buildings in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and evaluation of housing affordability programs in the United Arab Emirates. So Professor Agrawal served on City of Edmonton Subdivision and Development Appeal Board. He recently stepped down from serving on Alberta Municipal Government Board, and he recently completed SSHRC IRCC funded project on documenting the settlement experience of Syrian refugees in Alberta, and his Canadian work on human rights and the city is currently ongoing. His human rights work have led to his current research on Indigenous rights, human housing, and homelessness in First Nations communities. So, Professor Agrawal, we are delighted to have you join us today to deliver this speech. So, the floor is yours. Please start with your presentation whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good evening to everyone, and thank you for inviting me. And as I'm speaking, I'm making sure that my PowerPoint works. So I think here it is. And there. So if I could ask Chathuranganee, can you see the slide?
Yes, we can see the slide.
Just slide. Okay, very well. So yeah, so as was mentioned, my talk is mainly focused on human rights, equity in the city under the larger title planning regulations and its implications for city inclusion. So I'm going to just run through my presentation, and then, as was mentioned, we could engage in discussion later on. So I'll talk about two projects, and one is more of a pan-Canadian study. The other one is much more focused as to what you do with the information that you have. And then, we will sort of make some sort of connections with Sri Lanka. I wanted to say that that I have sought some help from my two PhD students. Both of them are Sri Lankan, and you may already know them, Pradeep Sangapala and Janaka Ranavira. So I wanted to make sure that what I'm saying is correct or close to correct. So yeah, let's just get started. And again, the idea here is to, even though what I'm talking about is mostly in the Canadian context, but the theoretical approach, the methodological approach, the legal approach may have some connections with Sri Lanka, and then you can take it from there in terms of what you wish to do within your jobs or within your organizations. So let me just get started with how all of this started. So there's a bit of a story and connection with Sri Lanka as well. So my connection with Sri Lanka goes back to 2012, 2013. And this was, my visits were funded through the Ministry of Higher Education. And I was invited by Professor Janaka Vijayasundara at the University of Moratuwa. So I spent a lot of time in 2012, 2013, and you could see my kids. I brought my family at one point, and they're all playing at the beaches of the Hotel Mount Lavinia. Again, just reminiscing my days. This is again all pre-COVID, when we could travel everywhere and visit and enjoy. So all of that resulted in a study, and which was meant to see if the city of Colombo was ready for numerous tall buildings that were planned in 2013-14 after the end of civil war in 2009. So if I recall correctly, there were about 80 or so high-rise development proposals in the works at that time, just within the city of Colombo, all the way from high-rise hotels, residential apartments, some overlooking the Indian Ocean, some facing the Beira Lake, and others in some of the other environmentally sensitive parts of the city. So this article, which was published with Janaka Vijayasundara and one of my students, explores whether the planning and development regime in the city of Colombo is prepared for this unprecedented growth in tall buildings at that time. So we looked at best practices from Toronto, Vancouver, London, Hong Kong, Abu Dhabi, which have had similar experiences in the past. And what we did was we also did an analysis of 5 high-rise projects in Colombo, and So this article analyzes and compares the state of urban design and planning regime in Colombo and that time, whether it was suitable for high-rise development. So we focused on Krish and Fairmount and Altair, Shangri-La, and Havelock City, and some of them have already been built and some of them are still under construction. So let me just now get into the two projects that I mentioned before, but how I got to it is, I think, is important. So my foray in human rights began in 2008, so about 13 years or so, when I was an expert witness on behalf of the city of Toronto. So this is a map that shows where Toronto is, where I am, which is Edmonton, and they are quite far apart. So this was a case in which city of Toronto was involved, but it was fairly a controversial case. It involved the city of Toronto and the taxi cab industry. So this is before Uber and other ride-sharing companies. And so that's where it all started. But the better connection with planning and planning policies happened in a couple of years later when the city was involved in another lawsuit related to a very particular section of the zoning bylaw. And I was asked to be an expert witness, and I was asked to provide expert opinion on this project. So the result of the research was that the city bylaw was changed, and then followed by changes to the Ontario's, that is the provincial, the province of Ontario's provincial policy statement. This is 2014, and the provincial policy statement is a very strong statement, essentially almost has legislative value to it, and it sets the rules for land use planning in Ontario. So that's across Ontario. It essentially tells what an Ontario municipality can and cannot do, and all municipalities must adhere to this provincial policy statement. So the PPS, in short, the statement of 2014 was amended, and which clause 4.6 was added. And the clause said that this provincial policy statement shall be implemented in a manner that is consistent with the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it was pretty significant change. And this clause was then carried into the new PPS, and this is 2020, and 4.4, so 4.6 clause of 2014 becomes 4.4 in 2020 PPS. And again, as I said, it's quite significant, quite important, because Ontario may be the only jurisdiction that expressly mandates all its municipalities to follow human rights in their practices as well as in their plans and bylaws. And then since I've published a number of papers, then I moved to Edmonton, and the Alberta Human Rights Commission asked me to do a similar study, received multiple federal research grants. And one of the grants is that is looking at human rights issues at the city level across the entire country. Just a shameless plug for my new book, which is coming out soon. It's titled Rights and the City, Problems, Progress, and Practice. And the book essentially takes stock of rights struggles and progress that have been made in Canadian cities, mainly by exploring the tensions that exist between different concepts of rights. So the book gets into, as I said, different types of rights, history and evolution of human rights in Canada, and a whole slew of issues related to individual rights, collective rights, property rights, right to housing, Indigenous rights, and so on and so forth. Then I wrote a piece in the Journal of American Planning Association, which is a fairly key journal in the area of planning, and that encapsulates some of the findings coming out of the pan-Canadian research on human rights. Then there is an op-ed and a couple of other op-eds I wrote in Canadian newspapers, which were more to do with the Canadian Charter of Rights and the COVID restrictions that we were facing at that time, and we still are. So let me just get a few things clarified before I get too deep into it. And that is to go over some key terms and just delve a little bit into Canadian Constitution before I talk a little bit more about the projects. So what are human rights? Human rights are the rights one simply has by virtue of being human. So it is fairly simple. If you're human, then you should and ought to have a bundle of rights with you. So these rights are grounded on the presumption of equal worth and dignity of all human beings. So in addition to the right to life and human dignity, freedom to decide and determine one's own destiny, as well as equality of opportunity are absolutely the key here. Now, how does it play out generally? So in the case of Canada, and so is the case in Sri Lanka, they're codified in legal form. So in Canada, it exists in the form of Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is part of the Constitution of Canada. And then each province has its own human rights statute, human rights legislation, and there's a federal statute on top of that as well. And since then, there have been a number of issues that have come to the courts and tribunals related to fundamental freedoms of speech, religion, association, discrimination based on race, color, ethnicity, religion, age, and so on and so forth. And I want to just add at this point of time that more and more planning related cases are coming up to the court and to the tribunals on the grounds of human rights violation. Now, this is another key point here, and that is to talk about some very fundamental questions. And they are, what are rights and freedoms, and are they different from each other or similar in any ways? So just talking about rights first, while no one definition of rights exists, rights are generally understood to be the fundamental normative rules in a given society about what its people are allowed to do or what they are owed by others, or the governing bodies. And these rules may be defined by a legal system, which, as I mentioned before, in Canada, it's the Charter, and you have similar provisions in the Sri Lankan Constitution. So a legal system, or social conventions, or any ethical theory or principle. So the definition that I have adopted here is rights are institutionally defined rules specifying how people can act with one another, upheld by enduring legal protections granted to individual citizens by the liberal democratic state. And it could be Canada, it could be Sri Lanka, or any other liberal democratic state. Freedom also has multiple philosophical, political, and constitutional conceptions. So by one definition, a freedom protects from state-imposed constrained individual choices to perform or not to perform certain actions, or to pursue or not to pursue certain conditions of character. So if you take freedom of expression, and this is in the case of the Canadian Charter, so if you take freedom of expression as an example, it protects both the choice to speak and the choice to be silent, which is not the case with right. Right would just say you have the right to vote. It wouldn't say, right, that you don't have right to vote or something to that effect. But in freedom, you have two choices available. Freedoms, however, are not absolute. So states can limit freedoms under certain circumstances, and there could be a whole bunch of them to respect the rights of others, in the interest of national security, public health, morals. So there could be a whole bunch of them. And a good example is our freedom to assemble or practice our faith in a church or temple, at least in Canada's case, was restricted due to COVID, and government could impose certain restrictions of freedoms to Canadians. Now, freedom is a necessary condition to enjoy rights. So for example, freedom of speech, together with other freedoms like freedom of assembly and association, are absolutely key for the effective exercise of the right to vote. So I will, as I said, talk a little bit about the Canadian Constitution, because without that, you won't be able to make connections with the projects that I will get into in the next few minutes. So just about the Canadian Charter. So the Constitution was revised in 1982, and human rights guarantees were entrenched in the Constitution of Canada by means of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. Charter has a number of sections, 35 or so. I won't go through all of them, but there are a few that are important for us as planners. So Charter, it's important to note this part. The Charter sets out the rights and freedoms of people in relation to government activities. So laws that the federal government, federal parliament, or the provincial legislatures, or even municipal governments make cannot go against the Charter. So the policies and procedures of any government agencies must follow the Charter. So the activities of government employees, such as the police, must respect the rights and freedoms as set out in the Charter. Charter does not apply to non-governmental activities. That's a key part of it. So it does not get into the private actions of individuals, corporations, and things of that in nature. One of the sections of the Charter is Section 15, and that is the Charter, that is the section that guarantees the right to equality and equity. And I will discuss the difference between the two a little bit later. But the two clauses within Section 15 prevent governments from making laws that create prejudice or perpetuate disadvantage. They also enable governments to create programs and policies to combat discrimination, discrimination against people of color, discrimination against people who have indigenous ancestry, and women, and so on and so forth. Section 2, Section 2 is important as well. It has all the fundamental freedoms encapsulated in it. So freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, and so on and so forth. Section 7 guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And this is for all Canadians. Now, these sections are important because I will get to them, and you will see how more and more cases have moved from Section 15 to applying Section 2 and 7, which are much broader, but they are being applied in planning situations. Section 1, and this comes right at the outset, and it basically puts the limit, and it says that there's rights and freedoms are subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstratively justified in a free and democratic society. So a recent example is government mandated mask wearing or restricting mobility across the country. And this exists in Sri Lankan Constitution as well. We'll get to that in a minute. Section 33, and you don't need to know more about this, but this section allows the federal government or any of the provincial government to come out of the Charter sections, certain sections of the Charter for a given period of time. So if you have any Charter issues, then you must have to go through the regular court system. So that is one. The other is human rights laws, and they exist mostly at the provincial level, but there is one federal statute as well. So if you live in Alberta, then it could be Alberta Human Rights Act. If you are in Ontario, Ontario Human Rights Code. The important thing is they apply to interactions between individuals and between companies, or between individuals and companies. They could also apply between individuals and government agencies if the government is acting as an employer, or if government is providing facilities or services or accommodation. If one brings up issues related to on the grounds listed under Alberta Human Rights Act or Ontario Human Rights Code, then there's a separate route for it. and there are human rights commission that adjudicate over such matters. So just to give you an example of how the charter and the human rights legislation may apply differently in the Canadian context. So let's say a landlord of a private apartment building in Edmonton, where I am, refuses to rent to a person because of their ethnicity. Let's say the person is of color, maybe Sri Lankan or Indian or what have you, an immigrant to Canada. A complaint of discrimination by this person who's being discriminated or thinks he or she is discriminated would have to be made to the Alberta Human Rights Commission, as this is the case of discrimination by a private individual, right? It's a landlord who's as a private person. And this is something, it's not sanctioned by law or by the government. The charter does not apply here. But if the government agency, let's say a government housing agency, refuses to serve a person of color or an indigenous person, then both the charter and the Alberta human rights could apply in that situation. So I'm taking a bit of a leap here. And again, I'm not a constitutional expert. But here are a few things for us to think about in the Sri Lankan Constitution. So Sri Lankan Constitution in its preamble says that Sri Lanka is a democratic socialist republic that assures freedom, equality, justice, human rights, and so on and so forth. Article 12 talks about right to equality. And then Article 12(4), subsection 4, relates to equity, but equity here is limited to women, children, and disabled people. Right to equality, what I have read so far, is most contested in the court of law, and much of it has been in the context of education and employment situation. With respect to equity, a few cases that I kind of noticed, there was a case about allocation of seats for women in local elections, but it was turned down by the courts on the grounds that it will create restrictions on right to vote. Then there was another case which was about environmental justice that was being sought against Mahavali Development Authority, in which the court found that the authority must consider the conservation of the environment before approving new construction. So what I gather is that legal scholars in Sri Lanka point to the problem in the jurisprudence, and they say there is a lack of full understanding of what equity means and how it is encapsulated in the Sri Lankan Constitution. Right to access to information is relatively recent. Right to housing or right to land property is not a constitutionally protected right in Sri Lanka, and we have witnessed some of that. This is before 2009, when there were large-scale displacements and evictions and so on and so forth. So as we all know, a lot of land in Sri Lanka is under the jurisdiction of the state and is managed by the state. So I'll just leave it at that. Just moving on this front, there's a long list of restrictions on fundamental rights of Sri Lankans. So rights can be revoked or suspended on many grounds: religious, racial harmony, public order, public security, public health, national economy, and so on and so forth. But the most interesting part for me was about this morality that appears, and morality appears as a ground for suspension of right to equality, freedom from arbitrary arrest, punishment, speech, assembly, and so on and so forth. And this is sort of is an area which could be a little bit muddy in the sense that what is morality and how it is defined and how it is perceived in the court of law versus how it is perceived in the society in general. So with that, I want to just talk about the first project, and this is the one where we're looking at the entire country, that is Canada. We have looked at about 120 or so cities and towns, some small, some big, and our main objective is to evaluate the soundness of the plans and bylaws of these municipalities in relation to human rights legislation and the charter. Why is it important in the Canadian context? Because first of all, it's a moral issue, and second, it's a serious legal issue. Violation of constitutional or legal obligations could seriously jeopardize a municipality in terms of the bylaw becoming ultra vires, or there could be other significant implications. So as you can glean from this chart, we have analyzed a whole bunch of case law, legal jurisprudence, collected relevant newspaper pieces, analyzed bylaws, conducted interviews with city solicitors, planners, legal professionals across the country. So here are four key assertions I would make. First is that Canada as a state is attempting and has made strides in safeguarding rights in the city to its citizens. And by rights in the city, I mean human rights, a bundle of human rights. And rights in the city focuses on how human rights are implemented in cities using international treaties and conventions, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and constitutional guaranteed human rights in some states. So I want to be clear that right to housing and right to own property are the two that are included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but they are not in the Charter or human rights legislation in the Canadian context. So very similar to Sri Lanka in terms of those two rights not included. But Canada is making progress in safeguarding rights in the city to its citizens. The second point is it's not just the state. The Canadian judiciary has expanded the scope of rights and freedoms over the years. Third is that rights in the city is an ongoing pursuit. We are still not there. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. And third is, and I will not go into details of this, there are variations of human rights exist from individual to collective rights. And it is a lot to do with the province of Quebec, where French, Quebec minority have come to some tension with Indigenous people's collective rights. So this is just to substantiate what I said. Significant progress has been made. I will not go through the entire list, but just a few that I will pick out of the list here. Ontario revised its legislation to align with the charter, that the study that I did and the result of it. Ontario provides legal aid to those who have experienced discrimination. Alberta now expressly prohibits discrimination based on age, sexual orientation, gender, identity. A lot of work has been done at the city level as well. Montreal especially has something called the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities that has led to the creation of Ombudsman Office. And essentially, if any Montrealer who feels not fairly treated by the city can approach the Office of Ombudsman, and they can then find a remedy to the problem. And very recently, British Columbia, the provincial government has passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act into law. And this is designed primarily based on the UN DRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canadian judiciary, as I mentioned, they are key in expanding the scope, interpretation, and application of the Charter Rights and Human Rights Acts. In one case, court quashed a municipal bylaw that allowed only a family member to occupy a rental suite attached to the principal residence. Multiple court cases have come up related to religion, primarily based on Section 2, which is all about freedom of religion, association, and such. So one case, Supreme Court overturned a municipality's refusal to allow a place of worship in a commercial zone. In another case, Supreme Court overturned a municipality's decision to ban the erection of eruv during Sabbats for Orthodox Jews. And there are a whole bunch of other examples as well. The issue of freedom of expression has appeared quite a bit lately, in which the city, multiple cities removed an advertisement that made explicit references to the honor killings of Muslim girls. There have been issues around safe injection sites and methadone clinics and cannabis dispensaries and such. But even with all of this progress, the issue remains around housing and homelessness, and a lot can be attributed to judicial reluctance and legislative silence on this particular issue, that is housing and homelessness. So two cases I would mention here, they are to do with affordable housing. This one case, which happened in the British Columbia, one of the British Columbia cities, in which the court said the homeless people have a constitutionally protected right under Section 7 of the Charter to erect a temporary shelter and sleep overnight in parks or any public space. But the court did not impose any positive obligations on the government to fix the homelessness problem. They only fixed the problem that, oh, where would people sleep, but not the larger problem of homelessness. There was another case in which the court said, quote, the Charter does not provide a positive right to affordable, adequate, accessible housing and places no positive obligation on the state to provide it, unquote. And then this ruling was upheld at the Court of Appeal as well. Recently, the federal government has put out a scheme. It's called Human Rights-Based National Housing Strategy, and how successful it's going to be, we don't know yet. But in my humble opinion, I think unless until we have housing as a legal right, I think it just will have limited effect. So with all of that progress, issues still remain, and I will not go through the whole list here, but the colored ones tell you that literally in every province you have issues related to housing and homelessness, accessibility, so making sure that the transit stops, transportation system are accessible to disabled people, freedom of expression, I mentioned before, freedom of religion is an issue that is coming up, and then the indigenous rights. So the courts have not been very clear about what is the role of the municipality to deal with indigenous rights. At the provincial or federal level, they have something called a duty to consult with indigenous rights on decisions that may affect treaty rights, Aboriginal rights, but that's not very clear at the municipal level. So again, just to sum up this part, Canada is making progress, taking strides in guaranteeing its citizens the rights in the city. Canadian judiciary expanded the scope of rights. Charter challenges based on Section 2, which is about right to, peaceful assembly, religion. Section 7, which is about right to life, liberty, security, are becoming more and more common. Right in the city is an ongoing pursuit for better conditions of city dwellers. Tensions exist. In terms of planning instruments, I think it's absolutely the key that the planners must justify if there are any restrictions placed, whether it's about minimum separation distances or it's about density or what have you. Those restrictions must be justified and documenting before implementing. And then at the end, a couple of suggestions I make that while crafting municipal bylaws, planner must consider what is the purpose of the bylaw? Is it regulating people, or is it regulating just the use of the land? And the second one is, will it negatively affect constitutionally or legislatively protected groups? Okay, so with that, which is fairly broad, I wanted to just hone into this project that we recently completed for the city of Edmonton. And it's a fairly long, 100-page long report, and it goes into theoretical framework of equity and legal test and method to evaluate whether a piece of bylaw is equitable or not. So that's what it is. And if you wish to look for it, you can just Google it, Agrawal Equity and City of Edmonton, and it should show up. So this is where I'm talking about. So earlier it was, I started off with Toronto, but this project is focused on Edmonton in Alberta, which is again the west side of Canada. Just a few, media attention that I got because of the research. I think it's quite significant in terms of its methodology and the legal framework that it provides for cities, not just Edmonton, but any city across Canada. So what was the problem here in Edmonton? And I will not go into what is zoning and what it does. Hopefully the audience here knows all about that. But just coming to Edmonton, Edmonton zoning bylaw has not undergone any extensive review since 1961. So we're talking about 50, 60 years. The last update was done in 2001, and that was basically to bring a whole bunch of different disparate land use bylaws together. So what has happened over the years is Edmonton zoning bylaw has become very complex. It has become very lengthy. It has all kinds of zones and uses and overlays, so much so that even the city acknowledges that a bylaw is, is mostly resulting in inequitable outcomes and preventing its alignment with the city plan, that is the official municipal plan. So what we wanted to look was, as I said, to inform the city's zoning bylaw renewal initiative and find any inequity that existed and how to find remedy for those inequities rather. So what we found is on this slide. So we concluded that inequity exists in Edmonton zoning bylaw, not just in the zoning bylaw, the regulatory part of it, but also in the public consultation process, the decision-making process. So it's much more widespread and rampant issue than just the zoning bylaw itself. The city has made progress in bringing equity considerations into the zoning bylaw, but has had limited effects. The next 2 points are important, that zoning alone will not be able to solve the equity issues in the city. And so what we need is a more holistic approach, which sort of encapsulates multiple dimensions of equity together. We have made 3 significant changes. Some of them were related to zoning bylaw, the others were to do with the administrative aspect of things, the procedural changes within the city's operation, and some major governance changes. Again, I will not go through a long list of methods we used, but we went through philosophical side of human rights, equity, the legal jurisprudence, looked at international, national, the best practices. We looked at city database that contains all development applications appeals. We looked at the appeals body and their decisions, amendments that have been made in the past 5 years. And we did a whole bunch of interviews across the city as well. So I think these couple of slides are important for us, and what I'm talking about could be applicable in any context. So question here is, what is equity? And I'll start off by saying there is no one definition of equity. But equity is profoundly linked to the notions of equality, justice, rights, and the fair distribution of opportunities and resources in a society. So equity is about providing more resources to those who need it, proportionate to their own circumstances, in order to ensure that everyone achieves equality in terms of access to the same opportunities. One would ask, what's the difference between equality and equity? Both equality and equity promote fairness, and they are the necessary means of achieving justice. But equality achieves this by treating everyone the same, regardless of their individual needs, while equity achieves this by treating people differently, depending upon and according to their needs. So we actually came up with a definition of equity, and the definition as it relates to planning and planners is: equity means allowing every resident to have equal access to all parts of the city to live, work, and play according to their needs, while accounting for the impact of the use of land on adjoining properties. So keeping the externalities of the use in mind. Then we came up with a taxonomy of equity, and there are 4 types that we came up with. So first is distributional equity. Basically, it's based on John Rawls' idea of the fair distribution of goods and access to freedoms as sort of the key determinants of any just and equitable society. So it ensures people's rights and freedoms by addressing their basic needs, such as food, water, housing, education, healthcare, through fair allocation of resources and responsibilities. Now, in the Canadian context, not all of what I just said, food, water, housing, education, healthcare, and others, they're not in the municipal jurisdiction. Most of the responsibilities lie with the federal government and the provincial governments, except a few, let's say, housing and some provisions of housing and providing clean water and such. So distribution equity may have a limited impact on cities in Canada. Recognitional equity is very important. It's about acknowledgement of and respect for diversity. So scholars argue that recognition is a primary concern of justice and equity. And acknowledgement is absolutely a central concern for inclusivity. So in Canada's case, land acknowledgement serves as a good example, where we say that Indigenous people who inhabited this land, and we owe, where we are and what we do today to them because they came first. Procedural equity is to do with decision-making process in any institution. And the fourth one is the regulatory equity, which is derived from the legal nature of equity as it exists in the constitutional and quasi-constitutional obligations of the local government. So Section 15, if you recall, Section 15 of the Canadian Charter, and it basically sort of looks at how zoning bylaws plans are crafted and whether they are in any way leading to differential treatment, hardship, or disadvantage to some people. So based on this framework, we came up with our findings in terms of distributional inequity that existed, and they're not many because remember I said about the limited jurisdiction of municipality on certain matters, but housing was absolutely the key. The way the zones were crafted, it did not allow multiple housing types, and it restricted people to go into different parts of the city because if they wanted a semi-detached or a high-rise building or a row housing, then you can't build those. The other one is food security. The city actually allows urban agriculture activities within the city limits. So those are, so one is housing, which is a problem. Food security actually was a progress made in bringing distributional equity. Recognitional equity, inequity, city plan, so municipal plan does acknowledge Indigenous people who inhabited the land and respect the cultural diversity that currently exists, but it doesn't exist in the city zoning bylaw. In terms of procedural, there were a lot of issues. And again, I wouldn't go into things because they may be very specific to Edmonton. but there were types of uses, the way they were defined, still are, they result in excessive amount of notification, consultation process, appeals process. So none of that was satisfactory to people. There were structural and systemic issues that exist in Edmonton. And then the way zoning bylaws are crafted have a serious negative effect on Indigenous people who have a different culture and identity. Regulatory equity, it sort of is related to the previous issues I mentioned about housing and homelessness and how zones are crafted and how uses are crafted and so on and so forth. So we came up with a number of legal tests, and they are much more specific to the Canadian situation because we went through tons of case law and we came up with some of these. So I probably will skip them, and just to wrap up this portion, we made a number of recommendations. The significant recommendations were about the zoning bylaw. One was to change how uses are defined, make zoning bylaw more accessible, by simplifying the language, creating a citizen's guide, reducing the number of zones overlays, administrative procedural changes we also suggested to adapt or adopt our human rights equity test, which is actually being worked upon by the city. The last one, the governance changes, I think they are quite important. We asked to establish 2 offices, the Ombudsman office, very much like Montreal's, and the office will be to find remedies for complaints about any inequitable or unjust treatment by the administration to any Edmontonian. The Office of Public Consultation would be one consolidated office which will be mandated to carry out public consultation regarding planning matters and promote public consultation or public participation as well. At the moment, the public consultation happens by different units. If it is zoning bylaw, that it does its own. If it is signage, they do their own. If it is city plan, they do, right? So it's quite disparate in that way. So we wanted to bring all of them together. So here's what the final conclusion of the study is. It's resulted in a sort of a guide how the city of Edmonton should go about changing its zoning bylaw, how to apply equity and human rights considerations. It develops a theoretical framework, goes through 4 key aspects of equity, a legal test, and then they could be applied not just to Edmonton, but to any city across Canada. Introducing equity requires a holistic approach to accomplish all different dimensions of equity, which will introduce reforms to every aspect of city operation and administration. But it also acknowledges that zoning in of itself has limited effect to propagate equity in different spheres of city residents' lives. But it does say that it is our legal and moral responsibility to ensure that planning instrument, including zoning, remains free of any discriminatory element. So I wanted to end this because I think you may be just listening to the Canadian material here, but some few key takeaways for Sri Lankan planners. And this is again, I'm not an expert in Sri Lanka, but knowing what I know a little, and then we can have more discussion later on. So UDA, the Urban Development Authority, is the key authority across the country. Although there are others that are responsible for planning, policy and plan creation and such, but UDA is absolutely the key principal planner and developer in urban centers in Sri Lanka. So I think what I'm saying here is that it should look at its own practice and see whether it is equitable across the entire country, whether it It is equitable based on the size of community, size of settlement, and who lives there, and so on and so forth. The dual function of the authority as developer and regulator could be a problem. Then I make a few suggestions that UDA need to enable and empower the local government agencies a little bit more, so that they are the ones who take it on more responsibility. They are the ones who are closest to the people. Then it needs to engage more in regional and rural planning. So my impression is that UDA is more about urban, and I think in that pursuit, the regional planning may have suffered a little bit, and rural planning as well. Although UDA has made some regional plans, but they are more to do with Colombo metropolitan area, as I understand. Recognize other forms of development, such as R, urban, U, rural. This is based on some of my work in Sri Lanka, as well as in India, but mostly in India. So basically what I'm saying is that beyond urban and rural, there are other forms of development happening across Sri Lanka, especially along the highways. I mean, I have traveled to Galle and Kandy and some of the other places, and you would see a ribbon development kind of happening along the highways, and they are sort of the mix of rural and urban. And again, I'm not sure if UDA has examined some of those development and see how they can be serviced better and such. So a few other points: local government agencies, authorities need to be strengthened, provided with more authority to responsibly discharge their duties and responsibilities. LGAs are largely bound to the discretion of both province and central government in execution of their functions and in matters of budgetary allocation and policy development. I think some attention need to be made there. Sri Lankan planners have the constitutional obligation to abide by right to equality, as I mentioned before, Article 12, and equity, which is Article 12.4, and equity towards women, children, and disabled people. Planners in Sri Lanka could use equity framework that I described before to evaluate their own plans and policies. And lastly, I would say is that I think this is an absolutely perfect venue and platform, which brings a number of agencies, academia, policy experts, and hopefully civil society together to arrive at more informed decision. So I will just end there, and thank you very much for your time and for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions later on.
Thank you very much, Professor Agrawal, and very interesting insights and very informative presentation. Thank you very much for that. And as I see today, the sustainability, resilience, and these inclusive cities and social equity, these have become even buzzwords in planning. And as a researcher in the field, what I have seen is in the mission statements, we see these words, and when it comes to strategies, implementation, and action projects, these words even fade away. Even the human rights, which is the foundation for inclusive cities. These sometimes this can happen because of the city priorities. With economic priorities and maybe political priorities, we sometimes miss to make sure these inclusive city approaches. So as Professor Agrawal very correctly pointed out, if the human rights and these inclusive city approaches are supported by adjusted regulation, most importantly, the adjusted regulations, we can make sure the human rights laws are protected, avoid discrimination, and even boost participation and inclusion. So it's very interesting discussion, and thank you very much for that. And to even make this discussion even more interesting, I would like to move on to the second phase of the event, which is the panel discussion. And we are focusing here on the applicability, to discuss the applicability of these equity considerations into city planning in the context of Sri Lanka. So our panel, we have a very experienced panel here, Planner Ananda Gamage and Planner Shirani Ariyatilake. And I think the panel is a very good combination because Planner Ananda Gamage can give us the lens of city planning perspective, because he's a very experienced city planner. He can bring the perspective of implementation side, and Planner Shirani Ariyatilake is very much experienced in preparing the planning regulation. So in terms of preparing the planning regulation and from the implementation side, they both of them can bring a very good perspective to the discussion. So let me first introduce Planner Ananda Gamage. He has over 24 years experience at senior management level in Colombo Municipal Council. He has served as the Chief City Planner, the Director of the City Planning Division of Colombo Municipal Council for more than 6 years. And Planner Ananda Gamage is a Chartered Civil Engineer and Town Planner. Currently, he serves as a Senior Lecturer at the Faculty of Engineering, University of Moratuwa. He previously served as the Project Director of the Local Government Enhancement Sector Project, also known as Puranaguma, which covers 180 local authorities in 7 provinces. And Planner Gamage graduated with BSc in Civil Engineering from University of Moratuwa, and then MPhil from Open University, and Master's degree in Town and Country Planning, and Postgraduate Diploma in Environmental Engineering and Management. And he is also a fellow member of ITPSL. So Planner Ananda Gamage, please share your experience with us, bringing the applicability of this equity consideration into city planning in the context of Sri Lanka. So over to you, Planner Gamage.
Thank you very much. Good evening, our President and all of you. Thank you very much, Professor Agrawal, sharing a very, very valid experience and exposure with very informative presentation. And thank you for the President and Executive Committee for inviting me as a discussant. Then I'd like to share my presentation. Can you see my presentation?
Not yet, Planner Gamage.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Thank you.
And maybe, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we can see it now. Thank you.
Thank you. Probably including Professor Agrawal, you all know what is city of Colombo, right? That is multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multicultural city. Most importantly, with population density is more than 17,500 per square kilometer. That is, most of us are not much concerned about that. With basic facilities are accessible for almost all the people. With last intervention from the UDA, the Urban Regional Development Project, and so on, especially for supply, sanitation, roads, electricity, as well as public amenities. History is going beyond 2,000 years. I'm not wasting my time for that. Most importantly, I like to share some of the things with planning ordinances as well as intervention with this particular thing. Our municipality was established in 1865 with Municipal Council Ordinance. It has almost more than 156 years now. And Sanitary Ordinance, Housing and Town Improvement Ordinance, that is one of the very important things introduced by the British government. Then our first, our municipal city planner was the Patrick Eddings. You all know that. It was in 1921. And after that, I think most of you may not be aware of the next one. Supreme Court decision against the cancellation of the street line by CMC, Colombo Municipal Council, in 1928. This is a remarkable point because CMC approved that particular thing to cancellation of one street line. but the people who were affected went to the Supreme Court and took this particular decision. This is available in the new law report, right? And because of this, as well as the former chief city planner, especially I like to mention his name, Planner Sompada Silva, they make use of this one for so many things. If not, current Marine Drive and duplication road may not be in the same way, right? With that, stop that one. Actually, our people went beyond the municipal bylaws at that time, and the Supreme Court too. After that, Clifford Holidays Plan in 1940, then the town and country planning ordinance in 46, and the Colombo Regional Plan by Planner Patrick Abercrombie in 1949. Then I like to highlight the most important thing. Within a shorter period of time, right? These foreign town planners, British town planners, prepared a visionary city plan for the city with the consultancy, with the very nice stakeholders consultation, right? I think that is the thing what Professor very, very correctly mentioned. Please consider that is a very, very, very point. If not, how can they achieve that? Next one, again, most of planners are not much aware. In 1960, regional planning scheme was introduced for the Colombo development area under the Town and Country Planning Ordinance. It was gazetted in 1960. Then the Colombo Master Plan by our planners with some other expertise from India especially. Then under that, probably the City of Colombo Development Plan. Right. Then actually, you all know that UDA was established in 1978 under that Colombo Master Plan project recommendation. Then whatever but at the autonomy for the local authority of Colombo Municipal Council, mainly for the planning purposes, comes under the UDA, the central authority. Then UDA prepared the development plan for the city of Colombo too. As well as in 1979, most all the municipal councils and the local authorities were under the UDA purview, as well as some other Pradesh too. Anyway, under that, UDA prepared the City of Colombo Development Plan in 1985. Anyway, there is a very nice book available. It was wrote by our institute. Former Director City Planning, Planner Nirmala Heras, as well as Planner Shirani Jayasundara, they are the authors. I think that's a very nice book. So you can see the history of the planning, history of the city and the country too. Probably you can see that the public consultation situation and the professional institute situation. Anyway, that is the 85 plan mainly focused on the development control. Then the Colombo Metropolitan Regional Plan was prepared in 1998. Then again under that, City of Colombo Development Plan prepared in 1999 by UDA. At that time, it was a very professional institute was consulted very well, but questionable about the public consultation. Anyway, the most nice thing was introduce the land use zoning, building regulation, building density regulation, development guidelines, as well as the professional responsibilities of the qualified person, not only the town planners, even other professions. Anyway, Western Region Megapolis Structure Plan in 2004. Then this is a little controversial thing. Then the UDA prepared the development plan for the city in 2005, and we were given our suggestion in some extent, but not much considered. Anyway, we were able to, diplomatically we handled, professionally we handled the matter, and we were able to cancel that particular thing. And with the UDA as well as the CMC, Colombo Municipality, and all main three institutes, town planners, Institute of Architects and the Institute of Engineers prepared a very nice development plan. Actually, UDA led the thing with the CNC, Colombo Municipality, in 2008. With the limited time and the conditions by the authorities, but we had a very less public consultation for that too. But you can compare the 2005 one and 2008, it's a mass, very big difference. Then the CMR assessment plan in 2016, with some amendment, 2018 again, 2008 plan was amended in 2018 too. This is the summary in nutshell. Not like in Edmonton, city of Edmonton, there are about 46 zones, but we have almost about 8 zones in city of Colombo. In most of our development plans are having a less than that. Right. Then I like to talk about the equity in the sense of the lack of inclusion or inclusivity. Only I am talking about 3 things. One is lack of accessibility, then the lack of segregation, then the regional and local level disparity. Probably lack of information. You know what it is. Then influence on the decision making. Even for the local authorities, when preparing the local authority development plan, what is the influence? And who are the people who are influencing on that? Then the disability. Not only physical disability. Mental disability is also very much important. But how much we are thinking about that? Then the segregation. In city of Colombo, you all know this segregation, low and high. Majority of the people comes under the law. They got 50% in so many states, as Professor mentioned earlier. Then elderly and young. Again, I want to mention the disabilities, physical and mental, because how can they access to their day-to-day work at least? Then regional and the local level disparity. Probably all of you are aware in the Western province contributing more than 50% of the GDP for the country. Whereas all other 7, 8 provinces are contributing less than 50%. That itself shows the disparity. Then the Colombo Municipal Council, where it was a capital, and now still the commercial capital. Things, physical and social things within that, and the Pradesh Sabha, even the Western province like Pradesh Sabha, is the disparity. Then I just want to highlight this one. Anyway, so far, more than 75% of the local authorities comes under the UDA. But only 30% of the declared area having a gazetted development plan. That means more than 70% of the things local authorities has to follow the general regulation without land. Sorry. Right? It all has each and every city. So the local authority has a unique characters. Within that also different zones, different characters, different land use, and different potential, different history. Please understand, that is a very serious thing. Then the stakeholder participation. Assume that if I am going to do some development plan in somewhere in particular or Jaffna, without a public participation and without a local authority expert consultation and the public representative consultation, what is going to be the end result? Right? That's called the equity. Then we have to redesign and current zoning and its contents too, because in the most of the development plan, even the land uses in the gazetted development plans are following the very similar format as As example, minimum site extent 6%. That is one of the blunder, 1986 general regulation, where it was only a small part, a small portion mentioned in the 1985 City of Colombo Development Plan. Next main point under the equity is lack of sustenance. Probably you know this. These are the people, planet, and the property. Environmental requirement, social requirement, and economic requirement. Which is at the middle is the sustainability. Is equitability, viability, and fairness. See where we are. Again, I want to say people means majority of the people. In the case of the City of Colombo, not the rich people. Right? Profit is mainly for sustainable, creative economic centers with long-term vision. Probably we know that some of the things that we had in the past few years, a few decades, where we are after independence, where we are. Please think about that. Then the planet, that is our environment. Anyway, all the plans are comes under the National Physical Plan. There is a comes under the National Physical Plan Department, the regional plan, and the local plan, mainly with the authority with the UDA. Then see about the sustainability, global warming, and the climate change. Now we are experiencing that, even though we never thought that. Now see the rainfall pattern, see the sea level rising, and the soil water intrusion, see that. And especially, see where we are in 2040. That is not far away. See the water stress, right? Is from the World Resource Institute. You can go to Google and see that. That is very serious. Beyond the fertilizer, this one is very serious for the farmers as well as the consumers like us in the greenery and urban space. Breathing, air pollution. I'm living in the city of Colombo. Now the air pollution is very high. But during the COVID season, COVID peak, it was very nice. Right. Then the diminishing of the forest cover. That is very serious thing, including the water catchment area. See that. Then the increasing impermeable surfaces, right? The city is covered with the concrete and the carpet. The resulting these things, high rainfall, inundation, frequent flooding, mainly beyond the city, even the agriculture. Any the waste disposal, right? We are polluting the groundwater. The water is the most precise thing in our country. That is the one of the most potential things. But we are polluting. Even with 6.1, we are polluting our groundwater. And see that. And even the living spaces, buildings, is that conducive, is that sustainable? We are rich people or the affordable people, we are hitting the air condition, but we are exposing our warm exhausting to the outside, poor people. Is it fair? Then right to equality and access to information. I'm getting only very few things. Directly to our local level plan. You can see that. Inequality starting from the development of plan preparation and the decision-making process. See where we are. Then the citizens' participation, as I mentioned earlier, and professionals' view and the local authority as well as others. Local representatives, not much appreciated. In the transparency of the development plan, planning process, implementation process, recently some of the development plans were cancelled, but I don't know why.
Sorry, Planner Gamage, we are running out of time, and
Okay.
we have within
Sure,
another
I will
2 or 3 minutes, if you can.
Sure,
That will be great. Thank you very much.
I think as Professor mentioned, as most of our planners very clearly mentioned, holistic approach is needed to achieve the multiple dimensions of the equity and the sustainable development. Anyway, these are the small things in the planning and regulatory interventions. In like I mentioned about the City of Colombo Development Plan 2008, we are strengthening the road network with a very wider building line, where probably now we can introduce that one with the bicycle lanes as well as the walking path. Not the walking path. Day-to-day life, we can walk that one. Now it's not safe. Then the Independence Sky is one of the good things did by the UDA. With the regulation, with the widening of the building line, we were introduced a very good compensate way for you, and you can go through that. And affordable housing for the low-income people, that's one of the marvelous projects where the UDA is doing under the UDA Urban Regeneration Project. Then a special regulation for the underserved settlement. Those are the things what UDA did and UDA is doing. I really appreciate it. And this is our responsibility, right? Mainly beyond that social responsibility with the plan. Anyway, where we are, limited resources, especially after COVID-19, all of you know that. Breathing, housing, affordable housing, and secured employment. 57% of our people, employees, are in informal sector. See where they are. What about their food, their family food, utilities, especially like electricity and the water? I think there is so many misunderstanding about the pipe-borne water. In our country, we can get the water from the water wells. But some of our planning things, we are polluting our groundwater, keeping the 6/1 or the 150 square meter one for the subdivision, and having a septic tank and the well. That is impossible. In the health, safety and security. These are my recommendations. Long-term comprehensive people-centric urban planning for not only the people, for the all living beings. That is the ecosystem. And public support and participation as well as advocacy. Creating multiple planning approaches, energy efficient, cost-effective urban planning. Good and best practices from other cities, and targeting the basic human needs. I think we are struggling there. And most importantly, there are so many laws and the regulations are there, but implementation is very poor, and enforcement also very poor. Where that is, all of us are responsible for that. Then other one is transparent and accountable and easy to understand regulation. That is very important. And allocating of more urban space for the people, pedestrians, and cyclists, and the people. With that, this is our role, according to me, and according to most of the senior plan, development of the nation in harmony with the well-being of people and our living beings. And as planners, we should target development with a holistic vision. That means we have more responsibilities towards urban development than other professions. City planning for people and with people. Okay, thank you. I like to share my things maybe in the next session.
Thank you very much, Plnr Gamage. And it's very interesting discussion. Again, you have very nicely placed the discussion to the Sri Lankan context. Thank you very much for that. And I will quickly move to the second panel discussion. Second panel member, Planner Shirani Ariyatilake. I would like to warmly welcome. She is a town planner by profession, having 3 decades of experience in preparation of physical plans for various special entities, ranging from regional plans to local plans, its implementation, monitoring, and enforcement. She's a former director, Urban Development Authority. She's having extensive experience in working at the Urban Development Authority, the apex body responsible for urban planning in Sri Lanka. And she has held key positions of UDA as a director in planning and director enforcement. She's currently engaged as a freelance consultant in the field of urban planning in different urban development projects covering city planning, social and environmental improvement, and regional developments, and so on. The floor is yours, Plnr Shirani Ariyatilake. Please share your experience with us. Plnr Shirani Ariyatilake, are you with us?
Dr. Chathuranganee, I think she's having a problem with the connection. Let's proceed with the next.
Yes, let's then move on to the Q&A discussion. And yes, please again, if you have any questions, what you can do is there are two ways. Either you can put your question on the chat box, or please use the raise hand option so I can direct you to the discussion. So meanwhile, Plnr Ananda Gamage, do you have any questions for Professor Agrawal?
Yes, one thing is actually, this is a small clarification. That is, main thing is Professor recommended to reduce the number of zones in the overlays as the users. In Sri Lankan context, we are having, say, about average 8 land use zones, not like in Edmund, say about 46 the original. I feel that number of land use zone, say about 8 or 6 or 8 or whatever, are required to match the requirement of different localities. But I like to get that one, especially as I explained that earlier. That's my one question. Yes. Yeah.
No, thank you for the question, Mr. Ananda. Again, I don't know enough about the Colombo situation. The only thing I would say is that we did a very extensive analysis of zones here in the city of Edmonton. And what we found was that the old zones and the zones that were created, let's say 20 years ago, or even the new zones that have been created in last year or two, they looked almost identical. And they almost all of them excluded anything that was other than single family detached homes. So if you are planning to buy, develop a semi-detached or row housing or whatever, they were excluded in almost every zone. So what we said was that it doesn't make any sense to create these zones when they function pretty much the same way. They are exclusionary in nature, their inequity existed in terms of the way they're crafted. So we wanted to have them consolidated based on the land use impact. So just in residential area, there are about 25 zones just in the residential area. And it just did not make any sense. So that's where our recommendation was coming from. There is a sweet spot between very few zones versus too many zones. And it may be possible for a Colombo with the size of Colombo and the density and the people, the amount of people. I think 8 may be just few. But again, I don't know. I think we'll have to look at it a little bit more, because I think you have swaths of area under one zone. You may want to have a little bit more nuanced aspects of zoning in there. But I'll just leave it at that, not having, full picture of Colombo. I don't want to say anything more.
Thank you, Professor. Small clarification, like in probably, I don't know whether you may not aware of the Cinnamon Garden area and the Havelock Town area in Colombo City. So we are having the minimum site extent is still 20 pages. That is means the minimum site extent, right? Therefore, still we are having the good greenery in that area. Good greenery, and that's a very nice area. Probably like that, we are preserving some character still in city of Colombo because of that particular things, and that may be kind of controlling, but there are some other things, and there are some overlaps within the zonings too. But keeping those, but some overlaps, we are keeping that thing not much big numbers, but keeping about 8, 10 zones up. I think that's really okay. We can keep that one. Because if we are not preserve that one, we cannot get it that back. That is the most important thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, based on neighborhood character, I think you should preserve some of those areas. Absolutely, for sure. And we suggested that as well to City of Toronto as well as City of Edmonton.
Yes.
Thank you for highlighting that point. Now, Plnr Shirani Ariyatilake is with us. I have already given the introduction about you to the audience. Please, Plnr Shirani Ariyatilake, please share with us your experience. How is the applicability of the equity considerations into city planning in Sri Lankan context, as you see?
Thank you, Chathu. Can you hear me? Can you hear?
Yes, Shirani, we can hear you very well. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry about the interruption in the internet, and I have to rush to my brother's house to get it connected. So apologies for not disturbing the discussion first. So I must thank Professor also for his most valuable presentation, that the planners' view has been changed, and he gave a new thought for the planners to think about how we should plan the city. And with all that background, now the topic given was planning regulations and its implication for city inclusion. And that main topic, we are focusing on human rights and equity in the city. So to begin with, I will say, I don't know, I completely missed Plnr Ananda's discussion and his presentation. I don't know what Ananda deliberate about the UDA law or anything, but briefly, I will say about the UDA law. We are practicing under the UDA law. The preamble of the law says integrated planning, where I want to emphasize that the law says that we have to look into the social, physical environment and also the economic aspect of the city when we are doing the plan. So integrated planning means we can't forego any sector. We have to think of all the 4 sectors together and do the plan for the best of the ability to cover all 4 sectors. But herein, the social aspect is highlighted in the presentation and today's discussion. I would say we look into the social aspect in greater deal. We cover all the elements that is coming under the social aspect, especially the population and its other components like ethnicity, age groups, their education level, the school-going population, unemployment, and also the school dropouts. Likewise, the society, the social aspect being covered greatly under the plan. It is also not only social, the other aspects also being covered. The economy, environment, as well as physical development. So coming from that, we do the in-depth analysis in all these sectors, and we also develop the resource base of the city and the role and function of the city. With all that only, we will be developing the future city that we are expecting to develop. So in that context, the zoning is a major tool that we derived at the objectives that we are expecting the city to be. So in zoning, doing the zoning regulations, as we are more concerned about the residential zone, I would say, I don't know what Ananda was from Plnr Ananda said, the residential zone, we have divided almost in most of the cities, we have one residential zone where all being equitably given opportunities the way they want to serve. Then there are special instances where we have special residential zones. For example, in the city of Colombo city, as Ananda's presentation, the first part I was able to see, he was going into 1980s. So it is a very old city where there is a good residential population, elite class residential also. So we have a special primary residential zone as well as well as residential zone. So there is sort of somebody can argue in this point that the equity is not maintained right throughout the city. But there is a purpose in doing that, because as well as the elite class also, they were living in a good environment with big plots of land, and we have to preserve some character of the historical city that it had, the green city. It was named as a green city. So we can't diminish all that and turn into general, primary residential zone where the land plots are small and density is high, likewise. And also I could say there is a special primary zone surrounding the parliament. That is maintained to maintain some supremacy in the adjoining parliament complex, and it is not for any discrimination or anything, but we have special regulations around the parliament so that the importance of that element can be maintained. It is not only for the parliament, but we maintain that for special religious places and also even for physical entities such as waterways. Now for Bolgoda Lake, there is a special area demarcated surrounding the Bolgoda Lake, because it has to be enjoyed by all the population, not only the person who is living by it, but the society, or it is a regional thing. So not only the local authority that it has, but the region should enjoy that facility. So such things being special regulations being applied to such elements, to it could be argued because human rights or equity or justice is not maintained for one person, but for the whole society to enjoy that. So that is one point I want to bring out, how equity being made. And also in the city of Colombo, when we were doing it, we introduced the development guide plans, so that if you get any zone where there is a particular land parcel or area that you have particular, not the blanket zoning cannot be applied, you can go into that particular area and do a development guide plan so that you can enforce the special regulations matching or catering to the needs and the wants of that people, or whatever. It could be the public places. Now Independence Square and the surrounding has a special development guide plan, so it is being developed accordingly. Likewise, not only for a public space, but also for other zones where there is special characters, where blanket zoning regulations cannot be applied. We should apply that. Now, also there is flexibility to change. Now, change of use is another regulation that is coming into force. So if you have a residential building and you want to convert it into a restaurant or non-commercial, non-residential activity, there is provision in the law. That is also bringing equity, where the people need something. Yes, there is possibility. But it has to adhere for certain other regulations, not only residential, but parking and accessibility, such things. But what I want to say is there is flexibility in the zones where you can have change of use and other things. Then my main thought about this, what is it, equity? My personal opinion is that the city structure is the main thing that gives equal opportunities. When you say the city structure, it is the physical structure as well as the infrastructure, the man-made structures. So the man-made structures, especially the infrastructure, will provide, if the infrastructure provides equity to the whole city, then the city population or the people living in have the right, or justice has been done to a certain extent that they have equal rights and opportunities for development. For example, if I say now city of Colombo, it's having so many high rises, but if you look into the northern part of the city, it is not developed as in the southern part or close to the beach side. Why is it? It's mainly because of the lack of infrastructure, the roads, narrow roads, and also the sewer. So for high rises, also that issue has to be addressed by the planners. And when we are doing development plans, of course, we select roads and we give building lines or street lines to widen the roads. We recommend, and our proposals being made, but the implementation is, I can't say weak, but it is not being, the plan is not in action on ground. So that is a weak point where equity is being, not being served for everybody. But herein again, I must mention, now there's a building line or a street line for a road. There's flexibility in the regulation. I don't know whether it's been still practiced because I'm not in the, not working, but earlier there was, if you open up the building lines, for instance, if you have a 20 perch block and you can go for 10 stories, but because of the road width, you can't go into that much of development, then you give the street line or the building line and make the road wide, and then you can have your development. So that is another equity point that we are bringing into the plan through legislation or planning practices.
Yeah,
then,
thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
One point I would like to mention here again is now we had the town and country planning ordinance. We had 15 purchase lots, but when the UDA law came into force, it was brought down to 6 purchase, thinking that the poor people could afford smaller plots rather than having big plots. But my question is to all the audience: can the poor afford the land prices in any of the cities that we are having, not only Colombo, even the suburban areas? Can the poor afford to have? By doing this, what my opinion is, we brought up so many other urban issues into the city. Firstly, the garbage issue. Those days, the garbage dump was in the same compound. We got compost and children had the play area for playing. We took over that and we deprived the children's right to play with the neighbors, and we didn't allow them to have any parks or playgrounds. Even the parks and playgrounds were taken for the buildings. Such things were happening. So, and also the urban runoff, infiltration of groundwater, rainwater. Then without having proper infrastructure, manipulating the regulations and trying to bring in equity to the city is I don't think it's my main concern is social upliftment and economic development will bring more equity to the people rather than trying to manipulate regulations. As Professor said, the holistic approach is needed to achieve multiple dimensions of equity. I quite agree with you, because the equity mainly lies with the ability for you to demand for things. So demanding comes always, you must have the social upliftment and also the education. Those things are important in a society or in whatever urban, rural or any. So people will have more knowledge and good jobs and their earnings, and likewise. So my opinion is, of course, we are trying to do the best for the people, and flexibility is there even to revise the plans if the demand changes. But of course, there are loopholes. We have public consultations with the people. Of course, maybe Plnr Ananda didn't agree. I know there are plans done with so many stakeholder prior consultation before the draft plan is prepared. In Gamage, And even recently in Jaffna, they have had public consultation, but always they go with the draft plan. So it could be improved. There are provisions in the law, it could be improved. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Planner Shirani, Ariyatilake. I think you have pointed many, like the challenges you face when applying to equity consideration into city planning through the regulations as well, and with the development conflicts as we were discussed before, the economic priorities and all the challenges they face. That's very interesting. And there are a few questions from the audience as well. Picking one questions on the rural equity. There's a question: in Sri Lanka, urban development plans go against rural local authority planning in terms of equity. How is it possible to overcome this in terms of?
I couldn't follow you. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, there's one we like saying that we live in an island where rural equity is seriously neglected, and also in relation to that question, there's another question: in Sri Lanka, urban development plans, I think not urban, the development plans go against rural local authority planning in terms of equity. How is it possible to overcome this? Is a question from the audience.
Is it one question or two questions?
A view from one participant, and related to that, there's a question as well.
If you can read the first one, I couldn't get it in rural.
Yes, the rural equities in rural equities seriously neglected, and what do you think?
Rural equity. Now, when you say rural, it's mostly agriculture and agricultural land use you get in rural areas. That is the when you call for equity, I don't think they have such restrictions as in urban areas, because they don't have they have a guideline of Pradesh Sabha Act. They have to abide by regulations, but zoning and other things are not there in the rural context. So equity is more maintained in rural areas than compared to urban areas, because they are not being pressurized by so many other regulations. So that is my opinion about rural equity. But there could be equity in terms of provision of infrastructure. Most of the rural areas compared to urban areas may not have basic infrastructure, especially accessibility and social services, hospitals, and they have to depend on urban areas for their social needs, especially education, health, and other aspects. So rural population is deprived of facilities rather than urban population. There is a discrepancy or the inequality. I mean, it is not being given to rural people as urban, but the living environment, I think they are not pressurized as in urban areas. What is the second question?
I think you have covered the second question as well. Yeah, you have answered both. Thank you, Shirani. So my next question is to Professor Agrawal. I think the constitutions, when we are trying to, how should I put this into word? When bringing the equity into planning matters, constitutions play a massive role. So as you see, what are the differences and or similarities between Canadian and the Sri Lankan constitutions that help or hinder planners from bringing equity into planning matters, as you see?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chathu. And I'm going to be short because I see that we have only a few minutes left. Listen, planners must recognize in every country, including Sri Lanka, that they have a serious constitutional obligation to live up to. Constitution of Sri Lanka is very clear in terms of right to equality, right to equity, and there are other rights as well. But let's just focus on these two for the moment. These rights are entrenched in Canadian Constitution as well, The difference is that Canadian equity section is much, much broader. It talks about nationality, religion, sex, disability, and so on and so forth. But the Sri Lankan one is limited to women, children, and disabled. But they are the most marginalized segments of the population in Sri Lanka. And I think even if the planet starts from there, I think we will be able to achieve a lot of equity within the society. The other thing I wanted to say, and just to very quickly responding to what was said before by Plnr Shirani, zoning alone will not be able to solve the equity problem, whether it's about between rural and urban, whether it's about within urban. Zoning is just one tool, and it only does one thing. As was said before, well, you can have a smaller plot for poor people, but that's all. What about infrastructure? What about housing provision? What about, we could go about whatabouts for a long time. Just one other point I'm going to make is that if you're talking about the Constitution of Sri Lanka, the case law in Sri Lanka is very, very limited. So the idea of equality and equity has not been explored extensively in the legal jurisprudence of Sri Lanka. Not at least as much as it has been in Canadian situation, where more and more cases are going up to the court and to the tribunal on these grounds, which hasn't happened in Sri Lanka, which probably will happen over the years, and you will see these issues coming up from the legal perspective. But absolutely, this whole session is to make planners aware of their legal and constitutional duty to the people of Sri Lanka, whether they are part of the Colombo municipal government or whether they are in the UDA or wherever they are. It doesn't really matter. So I'll just stop at that.
Thank you very much, Professor Agrawal. And relating to the point you mentioned even about the urban poor, if the poor segment is unable to purchase land in urban areas, what is the remedy to provide shelters for urban poor, as you think? What are the solutions for that? Even Plnr Gamage can give some input later.
Yeah, I think zoning is not the solution. As we see here in Canada, zoning has a limited effect. There has to be larger provision of housing from the government. I know that some parts of the Constitution and even the ordinances are very much like what Singapore has done. But Singapore, look at what they have achieved in the last 50 years, from 10% home ownership to now literally it's about 96%, but it's all government driven. So I think that the government has to move in other directions to help the poor. Keep in mind, poor people are not constitutionally protected as women, disabled, and people and children are. Same is the case in Canada. Low income is not the basis for you to have access to different things. So that is a more fundamental problem, but the government has to step in to provide other ways to help them out.
Yes, Dr. Chathu, this is my way of thinking. In the case of the low-income people who are living in city of Colombo, actually UDA intervention is we are really appreciate. We are really appreciate. That is under the urban regeneration project. Right? Actually, they are having, because as I mentioned in my presentation, our population density is very high in the city of Colombo, more than 17,500 person per square kilometer. Therefore, we should go for the vertical development, where now the UDA is doing that, right? And they are providing the apartment for these poor people, right? But most important thing is giving the apartment, as Professor also mentioned, not only the solution, because they are most of them are working in the informal sector. That is the majority of the country. More than 57% of the people are in the informal sector. With the total employment according to the enterprise report 2019. That is more better than even 20 also close. But the World Bank says much more higher value. But most important thing is why are they living in Colombo? Means because there are more opportunities for them in the city of Colombo. But most important thing is their earning capacity is very less. Therefore, they should have to get some kind of measures to less expenditure. That is the biggest problem. Even traveling from the particular apartment to the particular working place, they cannot go by cycling or even walking. Therefore, we have to go for that. Even the traffic congestion in the city of Colombo is very high. Therefore, we must, with the COVID situation, every affordable person used to have a private car. Then it is very worse now. Therefore, we should move into that different thinking. And other one is having a board. The most important thing, one of the most important thing is even electricity is provided mainly by the Shirani Electricity Board and the Water Supply and Drainage Board in the pipe-borne water. Both organizations are going on loss. Even though we used to say that their tariff is very high, their tariff is only covering the operation and maintenance cost. Both of them are getting the loan. Then we are really in the vicious cycle. Even the answer to the previous question, in the rural community, if you are allowing this subdivision, we are forcing them to the pipe-borne water and affordable people for their conditioning. Even probably you may aware, most of our planners are aware, in the city of Colombo, we are getting the water from Labugama and Kalatuwa within the Colombo district, close to at Avisave. But even the Labugama and Kalatuwa were just below that, it is called Paduka, they are getting the pipe-borne water. But without the water purification from the Kalani River and the Kaluganga River, we got the Labugama and Kalatuwa, they are very, very, very quality water. But finally, even we are National Water Supply and Drainage Board providing the water for the people who are living in that area. That means something radically wrong. And both organizations in the electricity as well as water going running cost. In the long run where we are. These things also are very serious things. That's the thing. Planners must think in holistic vision than the particular compartment or something like that. Sometimes we must think about the economic things also, because interest rate also matters for the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Flanagan. I think as time is almost approaching, I think we can make it like a wrap up. Like if you want to mention any, if you want to highlight any point at the end, this is the time, Professor Agrawal or Plnr Gamage or Plnr Shirani Ariyatilake.
I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. This was an excellent coming together with the planners in Sri Lanka and discuss some of the works. And hopefully something will stick to you and you'll take it back to your own works. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. As well as actually this whatever we are, this CDP, most of the young planners join with us. I think we must think, all the people must think. Thank you very much, Professor, and your exposure and experience and very timely thing. And another one is that mentioned in the CDP, we must think about the social aspects much more. Because at the end of the day, we were experienced in so many insurgencies in 1971 and this one, almost 30 years, then the 1989, 88. So those also coming from social aspects. Even the low income people, wherever, they are again, since of there are so many segregation and those things, they are creating so many problems. That is going to affect all the people. That means we must think about those things and having a thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Flanagan. Again, Shirani Ariyatilake, if you want to make any final remarks. Please, we can't hear you, Plnr Ariyatilake.
I want to thank Professor for giving a new area for the planners to think. If human equity is human rights is a main concern of all, not only one person, but it's, as a society or country, we all like to live in harmony and also have equity for everybody. So it's a good area that we have to think of. And I think our laws are there. Only thing we have to practice it properly so that we can come out with good proposals and give the equity rights for the people. But of course, I must say now, zoning is one tool, but when we are doing the plans, there are so many projects and other things that has to come into play for the city to develop and to get over these equity issues. There has to be economic development in the city. So that is also a main area that we have to consider when we do equity. We have to have other sectors development as well as to have social equity. Other sectors will also have to be developed.
Thank you very much, Plnr Ariyatilake. I think many interesting points were highlighted, and social inclusion should be key pillars of urban planning and development for the cities of the future. And inclusion is, it was also highlighted, inclusion is not more than, it's more than access, not only the access, it's more than access, giving access. And inclusive planning ensures that all people, regardless of their age, race, faith, ability, income, and gender or sexual orientation, the planning should ensure and cater their human rights, respect should be there. So I would like to thank Professor Sandeep Agrawal for sharing his Canadian experience with us, and thank you Plnr Ananda Gamage and Plnr Shirani Ariyatilake. They have nicely placed the discussion to the Sri Lankan context. So thank you very much for all our speakers, and thank you very much for the audience for their active engagement. They are so busy with asking so many questions, and we had a problem of sorting them out and what to direct to our panel. Thank you very much for the audience. And now I would like to hand over the session to Plnr Shirani Jayasundara, and I would like to invite her for the final remark. Plnr Shirani Jayasundara, the President of Institute of Town Planners, Sri Lanka. Over to you.
Right, thank you, Chathu. Thank you, Professor Agrawal, for your informative presentation. Plnr Ananda Gamage and Plnr Shirani Ariyatilake for your valuable perceptions, and Chathu for moderating the session in a professional manner. I would like to make some remarks based on some of the key takeaways given by Professor Agrawal. One thing is, he has said UDA needs to look at its own practice, how equitable it is across the country. Under that, he says dual function as developer and regulator could be problematic. Right, okay, but for that, I would like to say, we can take Singapore as an example. It's a developer and a regulator. Isn't it a successful country? What happens if the income earned by a state institution as the developer is invested in special projects? I think this is how UDA2 is established. However, the authorities may rethink of this issue shown by Professor. Right. Another takeaway is enable and empower local government authorities. Yes, I fully endorse the fact that the local authorities has to be empowered. Before the open economic policy was introduced, the local authorities had the power over physical planning and provision of infrastructure within that particular area. But with the establishment of authorities and boards in late 1970s, the powers of local authorities were taken over by the centralized organizations in order to provide an efficient and better service. It is necessary to rethink whether the objective is achieved or any amendments are required. And another takeaway given by Professor is needs to engage more in regional and rural planning. In terms of engaging more regional and rural planning, presently UDA has declared 271 local authorities out of 340 local authorities in the whole country. That means more than 80%, even I think closer upon 90% of the country's local authorities are declared by this, by UDA. And also the National Physical Planning Department has prepared the National Physical Plan for the whole country. and the regional plans. So it is a great achievement of preparing a national physical plan when considering the neighboring countries. Almost all the local authorities declared by UDA have either a gazetted development plan. It's a limited number of plans. There are reasons for that, or a draft development plan prepared based on the UDA Act. However, all urban areas are enforcing building and planning regulations based on gazetted regulations. Therefore, in terms of regional and rural planning, it has been practiced. But of course, it could be improved and more public consultation could be developed. Example, last week, I know the UDA officers had a public consultation prior to preparing the development plan for Jaffna. So these days they are preparing the development plan for Jaffna. I know they went there, they had stakeholder meetings and meetings with the local authorities. So they spent more than 1 week on these public consultations. So it reveals presently they are engaging in more public consultation than earlier. As Ananda Gamage, Plnr Ananda Gamage said, earlier there was very limited public consultation, but I know now they have public consultations, and even the UDA law has given that provision to have public consultations, right? Another thing what Professor says is local government authorities need to be strengthened and provided with more authority to responsibly discharge their duties and responsibilities. Yes, during the last 20 to 30 years, there have been many programs and projects to strengthen the local authorities through training and capacity building and financial assistance. I agree with Professor. And the establishment of Sri Lanka Institute of Local Governance is one of the significant achievements. However, their independence and authority have been diluted, both due to central government authority and the provincial councils. However, the ITPSL, the Institute of Town Planners, has taken some steps to fulfill this requirement recently. That number one is ITPSL is in consultation with the Ministry of Provincial Councils and local government has prepared a service minute to recruit planners to the government and local government authorities, and it is to be submitted to the Cabinet of Ministers for their approval very soon. Once it is approved, the planners could be recruited to the provincial and local authorities as well. Another proposal is ITPS has carried out discussions with the Sri Lanka Institute of Local Governments, that's a training arm of the local government, to enhance the capacity building of local authorities. There is a short-term proposal to conduct relevant urban planning and urban management training programs for the staff of local authorities in cooperation with SLILG. And there is another long-term proposal to provide urban planning professional qualifications to selected senior staff with urban planning experience by following the higher diploma in urban planning program conducted by the ITPSL. This program will lead the selected candidates to obtain the membership of ITPSL. And another proposal is discussions are going on with the Planning Institute of Australia and ITPSL to increase the capacity building of local authorities through a voluntary service. Another takeaway question given by Professor is Sri Lankan planners have the constitutional obligation to abide by right to equality and equity towards women, children, and disabled people. Yes, there are incidents happening here, but as a whole, women and children have the right to fairness in Sri Lanka. The first lady prime minister in the world was elected from our country as far back in 1960s. The health and education sector give equitable service to all women and children in Sri Lanka, whether urban or rural. We have government authorities who look after the women and children against harassment. And equal rights for women in Sri Lanka is much ahead of many other, even developed countries, mainly due to cultural heritage. Then regarding the disabled people, by law and regulations, their needs are looked after, right? So it is practiced by the planning authorities, especially by UDA. However, I would like to elaborate a point that pandemic has created an environment for online transaction of goods and services, online learning, working from home, social distancing, declining demand for urban floor spaces, reduction in vehicular traffic, etc. are some of the pandemic results where inequality is occurring. Will social distancing gradually create social disintegration? Will every resident have equal access to all parts of the city to live, work, and play? How can we resolve it through spatial planning interventions? Finally, the planning authorities have to rethink their own practice, how equitable it is across the country with the present pandemic situation. Therefore, there is a requirement to reorient the role of urban and regional planning systems under the prevailing situation to avoid inequalities in every sector. So we should remember planning is for the people, with the people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Plnr Jayasundara. It was very interesting, and you have nicely summarized all the important points mentioned in the discussion. Thank you very much for that. So then thank you all. Thank you for speakers, and thank you for the audience. And I think, yeah, we can wind up the session. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.